My name is Indiana Bones. I'm an archaeologist, explorer, adventurer, cryptozoologist, street art expert, and friend to pigeons. Join the adventure as I explore mysterious places, forgotten history, and track down unknown creatures. This is where Saturday adventures began. For decades, only this small stone marked the final resting place of T. Jean Kerouac. He's a little obscure these days, but you might know him as Jack. I read his novel On the Road one summer on my front porch, drinking woodchuck ciders and collecting unemployment. Then I started traveling. Jack grew up in Lowell, Massachusetts, where he was a football star that dreamed of being a famous sports writer. That plan was derailed in 1940 when he broke his leg in a football game during his freshman year at Columbia University. He spent some time away and returned to Columbia in 1942, but his sports career was decidedly over. Around this time, he began hanging out with a morphine addict and minor criminal named Bill Burroughs. Bill's grandfather invented the typewriter, so there was always money to get Bill out of trouble. That's exactly what happened when Jack and Bill helped another friend cover up a murder in 1944. Both were arrested as material witnesses. Bill's father paid his son's bail immediately, while Jack was left to sit in jail. Bill went on to murder his wife in 1950, and then used his grandfather's fabulous invention to write the excessively seminal abstract novel Naked Lunch. To the best of my knowledge, Jack did not participate in any further murders. After that episode is when Jack began his time on the road. He hooked up with a drunken drifter with a history of domestic abuse named Neil Cassidy, and the two embarked on a countrywide hitchhiking adventure that became the plot of Jack's most famous novel. According to the most popular version of the legend, the book was written on a 3-week Benzedrine binge in 1951. Jack taped together pieces of paper into a 120-foot scroll so that he could continue typing without stopping to change the pages. Like all good novels, On the Road was written in New York City, but it's up in the air if Jack was living with his wife in Manhattan or living with his parents in Ozone Park. Jack's first novel, The Town and the Country, had gone completely unnoticed, and for more than 5 years he couldn't get a publisher to even look at the On the Road scroll. He may have died an obscure drunk if not for his friend, Allen Ginsberg. Allen was the youngest of the group that would one day be known as the Beat Writers. For a long time, Jack, Bill, and Neil were just drug addicts and drifter criminals wandering around the country causing trouble. Ginsberg was not content to commit crimes and shoot morphine, though. He wanted the world to notice him. In 1955, Ginsberg published his most famous work, a long-form poem called Howl, and Kerouac was present for its very famous reading at the Sixth Gallery in San Francisco. Ginsberg was contacted the next day by a young publisher named Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and from here is where the Beat Writers went from troublemakers to literary icons. Ferlinghetti still owns City Lights Bookstore on the corner of Jack Kerouac Street. In 1957, Jack was living here in Orlando, Florida. On the Road was about to make him very famous, but he was still a nobody working on his third novel, The Dharma Bums. This little house was restored in 2013 and now serves as a residence for young writers. Kerouac was basically the Tolkien of Scumbags. He wrote a lot of books, but very few people have read more than 2. The rest aren't very good. Jack hated editing, and his stories were mostly rambling nonsense. Even the current version of On the Road on the shelves today is not the version Kerouac was proud of, but a heavily edited second edition. Remaining ever present in the literary scene, Ginsberg portrayed a rabbi in the background of a Bob Dylan music video. Burroughs was a spiritual guide for the early punks, recorded an industrial song with Ministry, and shot heroin with Kurt Cobain. Both outlived Neil Cassidy and Jack Kerouac by decades. Kerouac retreated from public life, and the world went on without him. Fame brought nothing but misery to Jack Kerouac. The last few years of his life were spent in a small house in Florida, living with his mother and newly married to his childhood sweetheart, Stella Sampas. He drank so much wine that in 1969, his liver exploded and he began oozing blood from every orifice in front of his terrified wife. Kerouac was buried in Edson Cemetery and for decades was commemorated only by a small stone that he eventually shared with his wife Stella. His childhood nickname was included on the stone, but not Jack, the name the world knew him as. According to legend, Bob Dylan would sneak into the graveyard every year to eat dinner with Kerouac. The stone was littered with empty bottles and pens laid in tribute. In 2015, a new stone was added to the grave with his signature and a quote, "The road is life." That has been just as true for me.
I'll be there to guide you into the great unknown. The great unknown. The great unknown. 'Cause I bear witness.
On today's adventure, we're going in search of one of America's most famous outlaws. The Civil War started in Kansas more than a decade before the rest of the nation. Unofficial armies of Southern bushwhackers and Union jayhawkers terrorized the populations on both sides of the political divide. There were bloody clashes with many combatants coming from Missouri to influence the new state's position on slavery. Missouri itself was deeply divided, officially a free state but with many residents in full support of slavery, among them the James family. On April 3rd of 1863, a group of jayhawkers showed up at the James farm in Kearney, Missouri. They were looking for a bushwhacker named Frank that had ridden with the notorious Quantrill's raiders. They found Dr. Reuben Samuel instead. Samuel's stepson Jesse was 15 and working in the fields that day. He probably watched the soldiers torturing Dr. Samuel for information, then hanging him nearly to death. When the soldiers were done with Dr. Samuel, they found Jesse near where the recreated slave quarters stand today. The lashing he received at their hands, according to legend, was the impetus for Jesse to join his brother first as a Confederate soldier and then as one of the most infamous outlaws in the history of the United States. Atrocities were committed on both sides during the bitter fighting around Kansas, but William Quantrill was especially brutal. His guerrilla fighters ransacked and burned towns around Kansas and Missouri during 1861 and 1862. With the raiders, the James brothers participated in multiple massacres before Quantrill was mortally wounded and captured, and his army of scoundrels fell apart. Jesse wasn't very good at being a soldier. Within a year, he'd suffered 2 nearly fatal gunshot wounds to the chest. The second occurred while he was attempting to surrender to Union troops on his way back to the family farm. The war ended, but Frank and Jesse kept fighting. Jesse James had a criminal career that spanned almost 2 decades. Though Jesse promoted himself as a Robin Hood figure, there was no evidence that anyone ever benefited from Jesse's crimes except Jesse James and the criminals that stole with him. A lot of legend has risen up around the death of this killer, and it's hard to tell how much is apocryphal. A total blunder of a bank robbery in 1876 had left the James Younger gang wiped out, with most members either dead or captured. Even Frank had given up his life of crime to become a farmer in Tennessee. Jesse was the head of a new crew of degenerates in 1882. They were holed up at a small house in St. Joseph's, Missouri, where Jesse's wife Zerelda had to cook for everyone. After the 1876 failure in Minnesota, Pinkerton agents had increased pressure to capture the James brothers. Somewhere along the way, they got their hands on Bob and Charlie Ford. Charlie was an old friend of Jesse's that had thieved with him for years, but Bob was a green recruit. Jesse had planned the one last score that would set everyone up for life, and the gang left Jesse's wife to clean up breakfast while they finalized the details in the living room. Bob Ford thought Jesse suspected the brothers were going to betray him, so when Jesse took off his gun belt and turned his back to adjust a picture on the wall, Bob took out his gun and shot Jesse in the back of the head. The Fords were arrested for the murder, tried, judged, and sentenced to hang all in the same day before the governor swooped in with a full pardon. He hailed the Fords as heroes, which raised suspicion that an elected official may have conspired to kill a private citizen without a trial by jury. For some, this overshadowed the fact that Jesse James was a violent, murderous criminal that didn't care who he killed. Justice passed over Frank James. He was expected to retaliate after Jesse died. Instead, he turned his pistols over to the governor of Missouri and surrendered himself to authorities. He spent a few months in a cold stone cell in Independence. Unlike other prisoners, Frank had extra blankets to put on his cot and a dresser to keep all his extra clothes. When it was extra cold, he was brought upstairs to sit by the fire. After a few months, Frank was acquitted, and this lifelong outlaw was allowed to go free. The terms of his release specified he would not be extradited to Minnesota, where his gang was known to have murdered several innocent people. Frank's final years were spent bouncing from job to job. The one-time murderous thug found himself toiling as a shoe salesman, and then as a ticket taker for a burlesque club. For a while, he was involved in a Wild West show before spending his last days giving tours of the James family farm. For a time, Jesse's body was buried in the front yard beneath an 8-foot stone that declared he was murdered by a traitor and a coward. When his body was moved to the nearby Kearney Cemetery, that stone was chipped away by tourists until almost nothing remained. Let me tell you about Bubblebutt. Despite the silly name, this is a very serious condition that affects thousands. Bubblebutt usually happens when a human crashes their boat into a sea turtle and the injury forces air into the turtle's shell. I told you, Bubblebutt is no joke. I first encountered Bubblebutt syndrome when I met Rocky, the green sea turtle, at the Key West Aquarium. Strange floats and weights were attached to his back, and I assumed this had something to do with the fact that he was missing his front fin. A few days later, we were driving back to Miami across the overseas highway when we saw a sign for the Turtle Hospital, and I immediately did a U-turn. You know that's not something Indiana could pass up. I hope this isn't news to you, but things aren't good for sea turtles. Everything in their lives seems to be on a collision course with humans. Their breeding grounds are altered for public beaches. Light pollution draws them to breed in unfamiliar and unsafe locations. Collisions with boats crack their shells, and discarded nets entangle their fins. Fibropapilloma, a virus that causes tumors to erupt all over a turtle's soft tissues, probably isn't caused by humans, but no one can say for sure. That's just a smattering of the ways we are bad for turtles. The Turtle Hospital stepped in to mitigate some of that damage. Right on the side of the overseas highway, the Turtle Hospital is a repurposed hotel and former strip club. The facility opened in 1986 and has successfully treated more than 2,000 turtles. Out back, I was able to interact with some of the permanent residents. The ultimate goal of the Turtle Hospital is to release as many turtles back to the wild as possible. The turtle must have 1 good eye, 3 good flippers, and an uncompromised shell to be a candidate for release. Even fibropapilloma tumors can be removed with a 90% survival rate. A turtle with 1 good eye or 3 good flippers can still hunt for prey on its own, but there is no hope for a turtle with bubblebutt. Also known as positive buoyancy syndrome, bubblebutt is most often the result of a boat collision. The trauma forces air out of the turtle's lungs, where it becomes trapped under the shell. The turtle is left unable to dive, and its body bakes in the sun. Algae begins to form in large colonies on the shell, as the turtle is unable to take cover and scrape it away. There is no medical treatment to safely release the air from the shells, even in the Turtle Hospital's state-of-the-art facilities. Those turtles must live out the rest of their days in captivity. Luckily, when the Turtle Hospital purchased the hotel, it came with an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That is now the home to the permanent residents that eagerly await treats from visitors on the hourly tours of the facility. Additional smaller pools are used to care for the baby turtles and convalescing patients that will one day return to the ocean. Turtles return to breed on the same beaches where they were born, so successfully rehabilitated turtles are returned to the location from where they were rescued. When I visited, there were even turtles that had been rescued from and were soon to be released back to the waters of New England. I'm sad to say things don't look good for sea turtles right now. The only hope they have are the positive efforts of organizations like the Turtle Hospital and the people who are willing to change their own behaviors to help out.
I'll be there to guide you into the great unknown. The great unknown. The great unknown. 'Cause I bear witness. I won't let you go unseen. When everyone looks away, unsure of what to do or say, I see you.
Fibropapilloma. Fibropapilloma. Fibropapilloma